It's great to be here, and it's great to have so many of my sources gathered together in the same place. I'm a little uncomfortable in this role. Traditionally, I am taking notes, listening to everyone else talk. I am not a scholar in any sense, but I have had 20 years of experience writing about Mormonism at the Salt Lake Tribune. So, a few years ago, a new reporter in the Associated Press's Salt Lake City Bureau was assigned to cover LDS General Conference. I chuckled when I read his report on The Wire, which said that then Church President Gordon B. Hinckley had been, quote, reelected unanimously, quote. Not wanting the reporter to be embarrassed or have to write a correction, I called him to explain that this was not any kind of election. But he persisted as if I were accusing him of not being there. But I heard the man say, all in favor, raise your hand, the reporter told me, and everybody did. He reluctantly altered the wording in his account, but did not seem to grasp the Mormons' unique practice of, quote, sustaining their profit with a show of hands as a symbolic gesture. And I don't really blame him. Joseph Smith borrowed the term General Conference from the Methodists, but used it to mean a very different kind of gathering. I've been to a Methodist General Conference, and it is very much a voting body, where representatives from different local churches and regions meet, propose church-wide resolutions, then discuss and debate their merits. My experience with that reporter has stayed with me and has come to exemplify the problems I see facing well-meaning reporters who set about to try to write fairly and thoughtfully about the Utah-based church, its theology, practices, and people. After watching journalists across the country, indeed the globe, scurry to try to explain presidential candidate Mitt Romney through an understanding of his faith, I have concluded that they seem to be using a Protestant prism. That affects their choice of tone, perspective, sources, and doctrines to highlight. Though the facts in any given story may be essentially correct, few Mormons recognize themselves in the emerging picture. That's because it's the wrong model. And it leads reporters to ask the wrong questions and make the wrong assumptions. Romney may have some personal power in the LDS Church because of his prominence in family history, for example, but he gets no special perks from paying millions in tithing, as some writers presumed. He cannot run for LDS Church president, as a Bloomberg writer speculated, if he fails at winning the presidency. The church may be against gambling, but it wasn't going to sanction the candidate for proposing a $10,000 bet to Rick Perry. So here's my list of top 6 mistakes reporters make in the coverage of Mormonism. Number 1, misunderstanding or misusing Mormon vocabulary. Latter-day Saints have their own lexicon, including such unique terms as sacrament meeting, primary, word of wisdom, ward, stake, general authority, and so forth. A little aside on the general authority, I had a colleague at the paper, came from Hartford, Connecticut, absolutely not religious in any way. One of her first assignments had to do with higher education. She had an opportunity to interview an apostle on the topic. And at the end, she said, "What's your title? What should I put as your title?" And he said, "I'm an apostle." And she told me, in her head, she thought, "Yeah, and I'm the Virgin Mary. Really, who are you?" So, yeah, the title thing is hard. Can be daunting to reporters trying to cover the faith. Sermons are talks. Communion is the sacrament. An all too frequent error is dropping Jesus Christ out of the church's formal name, calling it instead the Church of the Latter-day Saints. Plus, here's another problem. A dizzying number of people in a given ward or stake are called president. How is a reporter to tell if an elders quorum president has as an authoritative opinion as a stake president? Mormons have different worship services, offices, rituals, scriptures, and history. Number 2, misusing common vocabulary that means something different to Mormons. An LDS seminary is not like training for the ministry. Here's an interesting note. that I discovered while in Brazil. A Brazilian law was passed that required any clergy person coming into the country from outside to have theological training. So the LDS Church came up with a plan its missionaries are considered clergy, and so only missionaries who are seminary graduates will be called to Brazil. Of course, those are high school classes, but that seems to meet the law. An elder can be 19. A 15-year-old boy can be a priest. Missionaries serve for a limited time, not as a permanent calling. Then there's all those terms that Mormons use infrequently, if at all. Mormons don't typically talk about being born again. They don't use words like piety or pastor or even really denomination. That's not a Mormon term. Number 3, misunderstanding the relationship between LDS general authorities and leaders at the local level. The hierarchy is much more rigidly set than the Vatican, but leadership at the local level is constantly rotating. Again, due to the church's unique vocabulary, a quote, high priest seems like, an important official to a reporter. Romney is a high priest, having served as a bishop and a stake president, but so is everyone else who served in an LDS bishopric, and most of the men from middle age on up. How could a reporter decide whether a high priest is really an important opinion to get? Number 4, presuming an LDS bishop has the same power and role as a Protestant minister. A Protestant minister, Catholic priest, or megachurch pastor is at the center of a congregation, preaching weekly and representing the views of his or her adherents and the church. A Mormon bishop is a volunteer with a separate full-time job who is essentially an administrator and counselor. He doesn't typically give sermons on current events. Number 5, mistaking folk doctrines for core beliefs. This is especially obvious in those writers who use the Book of Mormon musical as their source on LDS teachings. The list of beliefs offered up to a newspaper audience often seems arbitrary and idiosyncratic. It's not surprising that Mormons don't see themselves in these accounts, all about planets, becoming gods, and magic underwear. For most Mormons, these are not ideas that are often discussed at their weekly services. The church's health code, again, is frequently miscast. I personally have called out Maureen Dowd in the New York Times twice for saying that Mormons don't drink caffeine, and was much gratified to see the paper of record write a correction on it. Number 6, treating all former Mormons as whistleblowers who promise to reveal problems within the faith unknown to outsiders. This is a journalistic model that may work in certain institutions and for certain ethical or moral lapses, such as cases of abuse. Former Mormons may and often do have compelling personal narratives that could and should be included in pieces, as long as they are balanced with equally compelling stories of satisfaction and conversion. But not many former Mormons are fair-minded observers of the contemporary church. During the last 5 years, I have watched an avalanche of writing about Mormonism hit the airwaves, newspapers, and blogging world. My inbox is awash with Mitt Romney/Mormon Google alerts. Nearly every story written about the man mentions that he is a Mormon. The word most immediately identified, associated with Mitt Romney, is Mormon. I have been largely impressed by the work of my colleagues on the religion writing beat, such as Time's Lori Goodstein, who was here yesterday, Kathy Grossman at USA Today, Rachel Zoll of the Associated Press, Adele Banks and Daniel Burke of Religion News Service, and Dan Gilgoff and Jessica Ravitz, a former colleague of mine at the Tribune, who have worked strenuously to understand and explain this American-born faith. Some political reporters at major papers also have spent a lot of time schooling themselves in Mormonism. But I have also been astonished at the misrepresentations, biases, absurdities, and flat-out hostility towards Romney's faith that have found a voice on the editorial pages of prestigious newspapers and websites. Joanna and I howl over some of the reports. She calls them out often on her blog, and I quietly fume. It has made me deeply skeptical about my profession. So let me start there and work backwards to the positive examples. Okay, believing the unbelievable. This is a common thing among some writers. We talked about Christopher Hitchens this morning. In 2006, Slate writer Jacob Weisberg set the tone that many others would follow into 2012. Quote, "I wouldn't vote for someone," he wrote, "who truly believed in the founding whoppers of Mormonism." Writing in The New Yorker in 2008, political commentator Hedrick Hertzberg said, quote, "The dogmas of Mitt Romney's sect are breathtaking. They include these. In 1827, a young man named Joseph Smith dug up a set of gold plates covered with indecipherable writing that, with the help of a pair of magic spectacles, he translated the plates from an otherwise unknown language into Old English that reads like an unfunny parody of the King James Bible." The late Christopher Hitchens decried what he said was, quote, "the weird and sinister belief system of the LDS." Then came the really unexpected harangue by literary scholar Harold Bloom against modern Mormonism in the New York Times. When Hitchens called Mormon founder Joseph Smith a fraud and a conjurer, Bloom said he didn't go far enough. Quote, "A superb trickster and protean personality, Smith was a religious genius, uniquely able to craft a story capable of turning a self-invented faith into a people now as numerous as the Jews," Bloom wrote. "The last 2 decades have witnessed the deliberate dwindling of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints into just one more Protestant sect." Bloom condemned the current president, Thomas S. Monson, claiming he is, quote, "indistinguishable from the secular, plutocratic oligarchs who exercise power in our supposed democracy." Bloom then concluded by attacking both the Southern Baptists and the Mormons, speculating on which would be more dangerous, an American president, a knowledge-hungry religious zealotry, or a proudly stupid one. "Either way, we are condemned to remain in plutocracy and oligarchy. I can be forgiven for dreading a further strengthening of theocracy in that powerful brew." So who do reporters turn to for experts? The New York Times and CNN seem to have given a platform to every former Mormon with a book. On several occasions, the cable news show interviewed Tricia Erickson, described as the author of the new book, "Can Mitt Romney Serve Two Masters, the Mormon Church versus the Office of the Presidency of the United States of America?" Quote, "I cannot explain to you in a few words here just how completely violent, mind-controlling, and alarming these temple ceremonies are. Just this information on the secret temple ceremonies would send most thinking beings into warning mode that maybe we all better rethink who our Republican candidate should be," Erickson told CNN. "I can't stress enough to you how truly alarming these ceremonies that Mitt and Ann repeatedly went through and continue to go to and participate are." Erickson, a self-styled whistleblower, said she was waiting for someone else to expose the evils of Mormonism before jumping in. "It just amazed me," she said in the interview, "knowing what I know that no one else would expose what has to be brought to light to the American people about this candidate. No one else has exposed this, really? Has she read the internet lately?" Sounds very much like the thesis of writer John Krakauer, author of Under a Banner of Heaven, who argued that Mormon teachings lead inevitably to violence. Another former Mormon, Sally Denton, this week told the New York Times that male dominance is the essence of the LDS Church. To be sure, the church patriarchy is a problem for many Mormon women, but Denton makes it the faith's central issue. She then cites Sonia Johnson, a Mormon feminist who was excommunicated from the church in 1980. That perspective is about 3 decades behind the times. Much has changed in those decades, and it is astonishing that she couldn't find more current feminists to showcase. She then goes on to warn the readers that giving Romney the presidency would be tantamount to allowing the LDS church free reign over the country. An ill-informed opinion at best, a dangerous stereotype at worst. Protesting the faith. Again, using a Protestant model, some journalists presume that if Romney or any Mormon is displeased with his church's direction, he should publicly criticize the institution or leave it for another. After all, most mainline Protestants align with congregations that share their political perspective as well as their theological views, and if they are not satisfied, they can seek out another wing of the denomination or switch to another denomination within the umbrella of historic Christianity. But Mormonism is more tribal than that. Even though they might be upset by the church's stance on gays, blacks, or women, most believing Latter-day Saints stay with the faith, trying to change from within. Thus, Romney responded very typically in 2007 on Meet the Press with Tim Russert, who had noted that Romney was 31 when the priesthood ban was lifted in 1978. Quote, "Don't you think, what am I doing part of an organization that is viewed by many as a racist organization?" Russert asked. Romney replied, "I'm very proud of my faith. It's the faith of my fathers, and I'm not going to distance myself from my faith in any way." I mean, that seems obviously to people who do walk away from a church that they have trouble with issues, that seems normal. But in Mormonism, Romney's response is very normal. Just yesterday, an African-American website, Loop 21, posed the question, can Romney lead America if Mormons hated blacks? The site then conducted an interview with Derek Evenson, an activist ex-Mormon. Everyone in this room knows that the LDS Church's history with blacks will be scrutinized and analyzed during Romney's campaign, as it should be. Excuse me. But as Max Mueller showed yesterday, this is a complicated history and should not be reduced to its most egregious elements. It is not in Romney's personality or upbringing to challenge LDS authorities or criticize its history. That is not the Mormon way. So, use of language. Some stories subtly suggest ulterior motives about LDS practices. Consider some of the initial stories about Romney's tax returns. "Romney has sent millions to the Mormon church," screamed ABC News, then went on to say, Securities records show that Romney found ways to help include the church in some of the company's most lucrative deals. Hint, hint, horrible. Underscoring the prominent, if little discussed, role that Mitt Romney played as a Mormon leader, the private equity giant, once run by the GOP presidential frontrunner, carved his church a slice of several of its most lucrative business deals, as if he was trying to hide his most lucrative business deals by giving tithing to the church. Security records show providing with millions of dollars worth of stock in some of Bain Capital's most well-known holdings. The message is clear. Romney was doing something nefarious by giving his church, quote, a slice of his lucrative business deals. Or how about this one from the Christian Science Monitor? Quote, "The strength of Romney's religious conviction now has a $sign attached to it. Will his tithing invigorate the unease that many Americans feel towards the Mormon church?" Subsequent stories did explain that tithing is normal and he wasn't doing anything nefarious, and lots of people give stock to the church. But the initial stories out were sort of, oh no, this is horrible. Even those who have genuine insight about Mormonism, such as American historian David Reynolds, mischaracterized Romney as a Protestant. He had to be gently corrected by our own Jana Reese in the Times discussion. In an October 2011 cover story for Harper's Pennies from Heaven, writer Chris Lehman put together a harangue about Romney's supposed view of economics that called Mormon teachings the Protestant ethic on steroids and paid no attention to the faith's communitarian strain of thinking. Lehman assembled quotes from various leaders, conservative members, and scriptures to argue that Mormons believe more than any other Christians in the, quote, prosperity gospel, a term that has mostly been applied to some Protestant theology, and it's one that Latter-day Saints would never use or even really recognize, suggesting that the accumulation of wealth is a major goal for Mormons, a symbolic of God's favor. Mormons, like Romney, may be wealthy, and many may credit their successes in life to their self-proclaimed righteousness, but it is not a fair or insightful look at Mormon economics in any way. My fellow panelist, Russel, called it balderdash. Now for some good examples. In November, Jason Horowitz of the Washington Post wrote an excellent story about Romney's evolution in his treatment of Mormon women when he was stake president. Horowitz revisited some of the episodes where Romney was patronizing, even bullying towards LDS feminists when he was stake president, but he also did his homework with more than a few Mormon women, so traced Romney's changing attitudes. To be sure, Romney never embraced feminism and still had tensions with some women, but he was able to build bridges with them in a pragmatic, problem-solving way. The writer seems to understand some of the dynamics at play between a young bishop, a stake president, and the women in his flock. I did wonder about this paragraph, though. Quote, as bishop, Romney exercised great power over his congregation. Besides appointing staff members from the local church librarian to choir master, he interviewed people in the congregation to determine their fealty to the church. Yeah? That's great power. He decided who would carry a, quote, recommend, a physical card that serves as proof of a person's good doctrinal standing and suitability to enter sacred temples. Again, nothing factually wrong with that paragraph, but it implies a kind of unnatural power that can or cannot be there. I have no doubt that Romney was a strong bishop, but this seems to overstate the sense of his empowerment and underplays the role of a three-member bishopric in the issuing of temple recommends. The Times Goodstein has written thoughtfully and thoroughly about the theological differences between Mormons and evangelical Christians, the church's ad campaign, and just yesterday about how Romney's position on immigration is more conservative than his church's, a story I intended to write before this. On the eve of the Florida Republican primary, Kathy Lynn Grossman from USA Today wrote a complicated and comprehensive analysis about why evangelicals are still wary of Mormons. It was well done and fair. Only one error, she said Gordon B. Hinckley rather than Spencer Kimball ended the priesthood ban, but those kinds of mistakes can happen to anyone. Even the best reporters, however, will never fully grasp Mormonism until they get past the Protestant point of view. The American-born faith, as many scholars in this room have noted, is really a new religious tradition. Though it borrowed ideas and practices and traditions from many other faiths, it really has no easy analog. To explain Mormonism requires finding reasoned guides, both within it and outsiders like Jan Shipp, Sally Gordon, and Max Mueller, who are available as sources. The more, the better, I say. It is also going to take more than I'm a Mormon for reporters to realize that Mormonism is more multi-layered and diverse than they thought. For its part, the LDS Church itself needs to do a better job of explaining its history, theology, and practices, and pointing reporters to writers, academics, and influential members who can. Reporters will not be persuaded when a male church spokesman claims that all Mormon women are happy with their roles in the church. Just saying that Mormons are not weird and putting a smile on their faces will not end the wariness and suspicion by outsiders. No matter how nice Mormons seem to their neighbors or how many values they share with conservative Christianity, they are living on a narrative unlike any other faith, complete with angels, gold plates, a cross-country trek, new names, apostles, yes, food storage, secret rituals, and much more. Journalists will never get it right until they recognize the distinctions. Such depth of understanding among trained journalists will not stop the hostile, simplistic, or bigoted opinion pieces, but it could improve the level of discourse about Mormonism as it plays out in this extraordinarily public time. Thank you.